Right, thank you so much, Carl. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're going to present a discussion on building knowledge with diverse students. We're from the Wits LCT Group, and there are going to be quite a number of presenters today, Lee, Moeniera, Kershree, Dale, and Nick, and we're all going to contribute to a discussion on this, and we really invite you to join in. So how we're going to structure this, I'm going to very quickly introduce constellations and then differences that matter. Moeniera is going to talk about diversity in our context. And then we're going to look at 3 examples of differences that matter for knowledge building. Kershree is going to start with an example from the biological sciences. Dale and myself are going to talk about an example of a difference that matters for teacher education. And then Nick is going to talk about a difference that matters in engineering. After that, we'd really like you to join in a chat about LCT and how it shows us where these differences are and how they matter, and how we can use that to be pedagogically responsive to the student diversity that we face. So I'm going to start with from Knowledge and Knowers, where Carl introduces constellations and selected groupings that have coherence, that belong together from a particular stance, a particular point in space or time, to groups of actors. And it draws a metaphor with obviously astronomical constellations, and which are a group of random stars out of many. And ancient astronomers put together certain stars, disregarded others in particular ways to form patterns. And these can be seen differently from different stances, from different spaces. So whereas the ancient astronomers chose particular stars to make a center in Sagittarius, we, in modern day times, really talk about the teapot, which is a differently constellated grouping of the stars in the same cluster. When we're talking about epistemological constellations, we're talking about groups of concepts or actions or objects or processes that are seen to go together from a range of possibilities, looking at those and the connections between them. Axiological constellations we understand to be sets of beliefs or values or dispositions or moral stances and the connections between them. Okay, generally speaking, those are condensed with meanings and can be charged either positively or negatively or neutrally in various ways. So that's a little bit of the background. Let's go into then how we're going to use this to have our discussion.
Can I just jump in for a moment, Lee, to model basically how you can jump in at any point? Just to say that the first time I ever try and introduce any of this stuff is usually shit, because it's really hard to get my thoughts onto page and make it understandable to anyone. But so I want to shout out two papers if people are interested in constellations. Your paper in the book Building Knowledge in Higher Education, which is a really useful introduction to constellations and how they might be useful. And the chapter by myself and Jagen in Teaching Science, which has just come out, called Constellating Science, which I try to do a better job of introducing it than I did the first time. So I think they're 2 good ways into constellations for anyone who's interested, rather than Knowledge and Knowers, which is a bit condensed, really, isn't it?
Thanks, Carl. Okay, so we're looking really at specialization dimension and what matters. And knowing the specialization dimension, you'd know, is based on two premises. Knowing is about something. There's an epistemic relation to a practice or an object of study or directed at a particular part of the world that sets up that epistemic relation. And somebody is always doing the knowing, participating in the practice, and where their dispositions or ways of thinking really matter, that's a social relation. When we're talking about epistemological constellations, those emphasize epistemic relations and often downplay the social relations. Axiological constellations are usually associated with a Noah code because they emphasize the social relations. So we're going to refer to that during this the presentation. But why is this topic relevant? Why does it matter to us? This diagram shows the throughput of the education system in South Africa. And out of the students that start school when they're 6 years old, only 8% of them eventually land up entering higher education. There's a big dropout in first year, and the studies from the Council on Higher Education show that by the time that they've been in the system for 5 years, only 3% of those who started grade 1 altogether actually qualify. And so the throughput in our system is really a cause for great concern. There's also been calls for free, quality decolonial education because of our background of apartheid and so on. Our imperative is those who come in, we really, really need to support them for academic success. So responding to student diversity, we've got 3 options that I'm going to talk about of how one could be responsive to the diversity. The first is to ignore the significance of their social identities, the dispositions, the contexts, the educational histories that they come with. That sometimes happens when either people are unaware of how they matter, or the diversities that we're dealing with are just so extreme and so many different diversities that it could be overwhelming, and one just wants to say, no, I'm just going to teach my subject, and if they get it, they get it. But that has dire consequences for the throughput of students in our education system. The second option is to provide additional support for those who experience challenges. And this is problematic in that it really puts the onus of seeking support on the student. You know, we're okay, we're going to just do the way we've always done, and we'll help the other. And it really does get a sense that there's some students that need support and others are just fine because we teach to those students only. And the third option is the one that we're going to talk about today, and it draws on the work of Lani Florian, where not all differences are pedagogically significant. They don't all matter for what you're teaching. And so the challenge here is to recognize which forms of social relations might be significant and interact or interfere or enhance the knowledge building in certain ways. And instead of a additional support for some, one formulates a pedagogical response so that everybody can participate in the learning opportunities that are available, and everybody benefits from those the supports, because it's part and parcel of what you're doing. You're recognizing that human diversity is a normal part of what you have in the classroom, and it's a pedagogical challenge to you as the teacher to take those things into consideration. And so what we're going to do now is show you how we've put LCT to work and to look at differences that matter. Moeniera.
Thank you, Lee. Right, so when we look at student diversity on our campus, we note that students come from diverse financial, religious, language, living conditions, and family backgrounds. And this means for us as academics, our campus has become a very interesting and sometimes also a very challenging space, because it forces us to continue to learn and navigate the differences of our student body, the diversity that they bring, and the uniqueness that they bring onto our campuses. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the living context that our students come from. Our students come from various living contexts in South Africa. And even though many of our students come from suburbs, in fact, the majority of our students actually come from under-resourced and deprived living contexts, which include informal settlements, farm areas, rural areas, townships, and inner city areas. If we look at the financial background of our students, just over a third of our students are reliant on their parents to pay their fees, but slightly more than half of our students are actually dependent on the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, known as NSFAS in South Africa, for their funding. So just to give you a bit of background, NSFAS is a government students' bursary fund, and it is allocated to students based on their financial needs, and their financial needs are actually determined by their families' annual incomes. Initially, NSFAS was a loan, but now it has become a bursary for students. Next slide, Lee. When we look at further breakdown of the diversity of our students, if we look at issues around gender, it's noted that at our university, most of our students are female. When we look at racial composition of our student body, the majority of our students are Black and the minority of our students are colored. For our international audience in South Africa, colored refers to a racial category of people who have a mixed white, Black, and Asian ancestry. We also do have colored and white students at our university. With regards to our students' academic or their families' academic backgrounds, about 2/3 of our students are not first-generation university goers, and about 1/3 of our student body are first-generation university goers. Right, so South Africa also has 11 official languages, and at Wits we have students that are conversant in all of these languages. Some are able to speak one of the languages, and many of them are able to speak more than one of these official languages. But what we do know is that the majority of our students do not have English as their home language or as their first language. And for us as lecturers, as academics, this presents some very interesting challenges, specifically in terms of the fact that all our communications to students are done in English at the university. And this presents a challenge for us in terms of how we introduce new specialized terminology to students. We also need to think carefully about how we word test and exam questions to students so that we are not ambiguous in any way and that we are really aware of the language and how we use language in our context, specifically English, because we are aware that language permeates everything that we do on our campus. South Africa is also a multi-religious country, and so too our student body. So we have students who believe in Christianity, in Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and various African traditional beliefs, which includes honoring of ancestors. Right, over to Kershree.
So I'm going to kick off with some of the examples that we'd like to use to illustrate how we work with diversity in our context. And in particular, I'm going to focus in on the teaching of evolution. So I, together with a colleague, teach this course to fourth-year students. And it's interesting that we place the emphasis on a particular epistemological constellation, foregrounding the scientific way of understanding evolution. So we really emphasize, the need for, or the understanding of the scientific method, and the need for evidence to be able to underpin scientific theories. And so we start off the course very much foregrounding that we want to emphasize, or that we're approaching the course with the scientific way of understanding being foregrounded. But as you see, as we go through the slides, the next few slides, there's a lot of other factors that come into play in the way that students engage with the topic of evolution. So on the left, you see just an overview of the epistemological constellation that we focus on. And students tend to be okay with everything. We foreground the idea of evolution being the reason for the biodiversity that we see. We talk about artificial and natural selection, and we link it to genetic mutations. And of course, this is sort of the typical constellation that you would find in any textbook. And we try to foreground that's what the emphasis of the course is. The issue comes in when we get to the point of dealing with human evolution. And that's where we tend to get other epistemological constellations coming in, as well as axiological constellations based on who the students are and their backgrounds and their views on biodiversity, and particularly on how humans came to be on Earth. Lee, we can go to the next slide. So just to highlight then some of the different constellations that come into play, and linking very much to the diversity in the classroom, is that in South Africa, we have quite an interesting political and historical context. We have a legacy of colonization, we have the history of apartheid as well. And so there are these double whammies that have influenced the way people see themselves in relation to others, and very deep-seated issues when it comes to the ideas that underpin things like apartheid and colonialism. So if we think about it, these constructs, which have very strong epistemological constellations within them as well, they were based on this notion of the Black African as being less evolved than Europeans. This idea that how should I say, that there's this link, that there's a closer link to monkeys between Africans than someone of European descent. And of course, there are all these racist and dehumanizing slurs, and they have a particular connotation in our particular context. And an example of this is when H&M ran, it was a marketing or an advert for one of their products, and on the jacket that was advertised was "Coolest Monkey in the Jungle," and they had this on a Black African child. And of course, there was a huge outcry about it, because in our context, and it is a very strongly charged context when it comes to this particular issue, is this idea of this link, or this idea of the association between Black Africans and monkeys. And so, there have been other issues in social media and things like that of people using these racist slurs related to these ideas that can find their roots in some of the evolutionary theories. Now, of course, something like Lamarck or all of these theories that have been put forward that have this kind of connotation have been thoroughly debunked. You know, we have the genetic evidence that completely obliterates some of these very racist ideas about evolution. But the thing is that students are aware of it in terms of their outlook, in terms of the conversations that are had. And of course, our job is to actually make it very clear what the scientific evidence is and to debunk the myths that are existing there. But we also can't get away from the fact that that there is a certain charge around these. And so it becomes very important to acknowledge this and to bring it to the fore. So that's the political and the historical context that can come to bear when we're teaching evolution. The other is the cultural practices. You know, in a lot of the African cultures, there is this idea of honoring the ancestors, and it plays quite a significant role in the actual cultural practices. Now, when we talk about ancestors in the context of evolution, it has a particular meaning in terms of thinking about the last common ancestor or something like that. And of course, in a cultural sense, the ancestor is someone who has passed on, but who will still have some influence on the living. And so, you know, we have to actually address this concept of ancestry and ancestors in a very explicit way, because I mean, for one, we might not have we don't have first language English speakers, so we have to unpack the actual, the word ancestors, and we have to talk about the different contexts and the meaning of this word in different contexts as well. The other issue is the idea of working with bones, you know, in paleontology, and the disturbing of bones has a very negative connotation in many of the South African cultures. And so we have to really emphasize the fact that we're dealing with castes and really bring this to the fore as well, and acknowledge some of the discomfort that might come with the idea of people working with bones. And of course, there are these different epistemologies that exist within South Africa as well, and we have to acknowledge that very explicitly that science is one way of coming to understand the world, and that we acknowledge that there are other ways, there are other knowledge traditions and other ideologies about how life came to be on Earth. And so we have to acknowledge that and honor that as well. And we have to make space for that in the classroom when we're talking about something, even though we've chosen to foreground the scientific approach to understanding this. Of course, there are the religious beliefs as well, and this is very well researched in terms of the teaching of evolution. There's a lot about all the different ways of, or the different belief systems, and how this comes to impact in the classroom, and we have to take that into account as well. And then finally, very much in the context of South Africa, is the educational background. You know, in South Africa, we could have religious focused schools. For example, we could have Muslim schools. We do have Muslim schools. We have Christian-based schools. And we have students coming from all of these different schooling backgrounds. And of course, depending on the schools that they went to, the way that, that evolution would have been taught would either have emphasized certain things and amplified that in the classroom, or it would have been filtered out. And that would then influence how students engage with it, because their prior knowledge is very different, or could be very different. The other issue is that a lot of the teachers that have taught our students might not necessarily have even been taught evolution themselves, because of the legacy of apartheid's Christian nationalist education. Evolution was not part of the curriculum prior to 1994, and in fact, it was actually formally brought in much later. And so teachers' views on evolution also need to be taken into consideration, because that does have an impact on the kinds of epistemological constellations that students come in with, and the ideas that they hold about evolution. So our pedagogical response, Lee, you can move to the next slide, is to actually acknowledge and to normalize the difference right up front. And in the literature, there are quite a number of these surveys available to measure the acceptance of evolution. And what we have chosen to do is to actually start off the particular topic on the teaching of human evolution with these surveys, with this particular survey. So we get the students to take the survey, to rate themselves, and they're often quite surprised at whether they turn out to have a very low level of acceptance. I've had very interesting conversations with students saying, well, I really didn't think that I had such a low level of acceptance for evolution. And then what it does is it creates an opening for students to be able to then discuss what could be behind their low level of acceptance. And what it opens up is this room for sharing different perspectives, for sharing different ways of understanding. And yeah, it just opens up to be able to acknowledge the difference, to bring in all of these different constellations into the classroom space. Lee, we can go to the next slide. So the effects of acknowledging diversity is that it basically makes students more amenable to engaging with and accommodating the scientific epistemological constellations, because we are explicit about the fact that we're saying that we know that there are these other constellations that can exist and that do exist. But what we're choosing to do is to foreground a particular constellation within the context of the course. And it also highlights, particularly in the conversation we have following the survey, that knowledge building can be messy and it can be emotional as well. And I think that actually, given from my experience, just acknowledging that that there is an emotional aspect to this actually somehow changes the dynamic in the classroom and makes people a lot more open to discussing things. It also creates greater awareness of different stances amongst peers and a greater willingness to explore different ideas. And in a sense, it also addresses some of the issues of coloniality and the demands or the calls for decolonized education, because we're making space to be able to bring in different epistemologies in the classroom, even if it's just by way of acknowledging it. And so eventually it leads to greater social cohesion in the classroom. So students basically examine their differences in relation to each other and in relation to that the scientific epistemological constellation. So I'm just going to hand over to Lee now, just to highlight some of the key issues in relation to the bigger discussion that we're having. Thanks.
Thanks, Kershree. So what social relations or what Noah attributes are significant when one is teaching something like evolution? And Kershree showed us the impact of the social identity, the religious beliefs, the cultural practices, political context, and their educational background. Why does this matter? If one ignores it, there's the potential for the technical term clusterfucking, where students are simply, because of what they believe in so strongly and so emotively, and that they just dismiss anything that the course has to offer. So to deal with these constellation clashes up front is what the pedagogical intervention is, and to make those diverse stances on evolution an object of study in itself before going into the epistemological constellation that's the target of the course. Right, we're now going to look at another example from teacher education, and I'm going to hand over to Dale.
Thank you, Lee, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about trainee teachers being the only people who arrive at their studies with 12 or more years experience in their future work environments. And Dan Lorty has a really useful name for this phenomenon. He calls it the Apprenticeship of Observation. And he says that while they are school students, trainee teachers create very strong and often very clear pictures about what teachers do and what teaching is as they watch their own teachers at work. Now, Moeniera spoke a little bit about, or quite a lot about, the diverse context from which Wits students come. And our students' schooling contexts are absolutely no different. In a South African context, our trainee teachers may be drawn from a vast array of schools. We have some schools that do not have electricity, running water, or even toilets. And then we've got schools with state-of-the-art technologies and facilities and everything in between. And so for all the trainee teachers, because the classroom is a familiar space, having spent so long in it, they regard teaching as something of a familiar practice. And while these first socializations are certainly a start of that legitimate teacher gaze, they can be fragmented and represent a partial view of teaching. The reason for this is because the students only see the visible routines of teaching. And so they may overemphasize certain aspects of teaching as important and undervalue others. So in your more disadvantaged schools, for example, the teacher may take on the role of carer for the children because there is perhaps little support for the students at home. And so the work of the teacher caring for children and supporting them is a lot more visible than their professional work with knowledge. And so what ends up happening is the complexity of teaching is not conveyed by these observations because the students see the actions of the teacher, not her reasoning about the practice and reasoning in practice. Students that are taught by excellent teachers also arrive with incomplete understandings of what teachers do. Excellent teachers make teaching look effortless, and those hours of preparation and thinking, you can't see them. They're not visible to students. When teachers do more than just, get students to memorize a couple of facts, teaching becomes reduced to a mechanical task. And so the future teachers, either way, get very incomplete messages about what matters for professional teaching. And if we look at the next slide, we can start to understand why education researchers like Lee Schulman, Linda Darling-Hammond, and our South African scholar Wally Morrow all agree that teaching as a practice revolves around interactions between knowledge, students, and the teacher. The teacher needs to manage knowledge in specialized ways, and the teacher needs to manage the students in specialized ways in order for those students to work with that knowledge. However, because those classrooms are such familiar environments, trainee teachers are often convinced that they already know how to teach. They just need to get the paper to prove it. They're just here to get that qualification and they're set. And they are sometimes told that you're a born teacher. You got all the right dispositions. You're caring, you're loving, you're really good with children, and that's all it takes. The rest is fine. The issue comes in that in such cases, they can disregard those crucial parts of teacher preparation. And this would have dire consequences for an education system like ours, which is trying to transform itself through various means, including quality initial teacher education. So part of what initial teacher education must do, part of its mission, is to ensure that trainee teachers develop a really clear understanding of teachers' work. And Lee will explain this a little bit more.
Thanks, Dale. So what we need to do is that these assumptions about teaching are so tacit that we've actually find that we've got to bring them up to the surface, make them visible, and let students work with their own understandings of teaching and whatever part of teachers' work they've seen use that as a starting point to build a more sophisticated, more complex constellation of teachers' work. So the approach we do is we have them start, our academic year starts in February, and on the very, very first lecture, we give them a whole lot of tasks. A survey about teachers' work, what's important, what's not, describing a teacher that had a major impact on them and what they valued about that teacher, the ways that teachers have helped their learning or hindered their learning during their own schooling, and an analogy, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. We asked them to do those same tasks in October, and then they start to see the shifts over time. So I want to talk.
Lee, can I just ask something?
Yes.
Now, do they jump more on the positive experiences or the negative? I mean, if you were to ask people here,
Very much on the positive. But I'll show you an example of what is charged most positively is the care work that teachers do.
I was going to say that I can't imagine that would be the case. I mean, I have no evidence for this, but I just simply can't imagine that would be the case in Australia. I think people would be very quick to jump on all the ways in which they felt, somehow impeded by teachers in the past.
Pink Floyd and so on.
Yeah,
Indeed.
that's just a gut feeling I have.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see. So what we do, one of the things, the task that I'm going to just talk about, as I say, it's one of many, but it's the one that I want to spend a little bit of time today. We take them on a little bit of an autonomy tour, and we ask them to make an analogy between being a teacher and being something else. So you'll see at the top, being a teacher, the positional autonomy in an autonomy tour, when it's weaker, being something else. And they very often draw on something from their own contexts, like taxi drivers or the people who do their hair and so on. And then the relational autonomy, we've got on the right-hand side, the nature of teachers' work and the nature of other people's work. And what Lakoff and Johnson talk about in their cognitive metaphor theory is that the choice of the image and the choice of the grounds of the comparison reveals something about the tacit beliefs and the assumptions and the conceptions that students hold, or that people hold when they make metaphors about something that is the most significant, the most salient. So we give them this as one of their tasks. Being a teacher, we start in the sovereign code is like being and they pick from the exotic code, they pick something completely different and then explain to us why, because, give us the reasons. And we find things like being a teacher is like being a policeman because you got to keep children out of bad places. And the conception of teaching there is that it's a relativist practice. There's no specialized knowledge, there's no specialized disposition, really it's babysitting. And if those assumptions are not unpacked, it really has implications when the students go into the schools to teach, because their job then is keep them busy. It doesn't matter what I teach, just keep the kids busy until it's home time and then send them home. Lots of them are about, being a teacher is like being a pastor and it's my job to give guidance. Lots of analogies like that. So I'm going to actually show you the real data from our students, and this is typical because about 66% in a study that Elizabeth Walton and I did, we found that 66% of metaphors were of this sort. So teachers are like social workers who work to help children by talking to them about their psychological issues that affect them. Teachers need to understand these issues that cause learners to be distracted. Like teachers, social workers help children face their fears so that they can have the courage to go out there and live their dreams. And so if we look at that constellation that we're interested in, how teachers work with knowledge, how teachers work with children so that children work with knowledge, we find no evidence of that in their initial conceptions of teachers' work. What is so positively charged is that kind, caring investment in children's well-being and motivating them. And in my PhD study, what I found was when we were not challenging this in first year level, we were doing crisis management with fourth year students just before qualification, because they were still not working with knowledge properly. And kind of every lesson kind of then just a couple of facts and then devolved into, you can do it. All you need is to believe in yourself and you can be anything you like, without actually giving them that powerful knowledge and the tools and the concepts to engage in global conversations. So very partial constellation reflected in this. What we then do is we take in the students' original, their initial responses to these various tasks in February, and we withhold them. And we don't let them see them until the end of the year. And we take them on a process of very explicitly taking them through managing students, managing their learning, managing knowledge, managing classrooms. So how do we get them to, for example, learn to see the management of knowledge? We teach them explicitly semantic waving and let them, as part of their assessment, analyze their readings, semantic waves in their readings, semantic waves in their essays, semantic waves then in textbook extracts, semantic waves in recorded lessons that they observe. And so we make working with knowledge part of the object of study of the course. And at the end of the year, in October, for example, that very same student who talked about the social work, her revised metaphor was this: we need, being a teacher is like being a hairstylist. And a hairstylist needs to know all the things that she needs to work with, and knowing her customers is important to meet their needs. In the same way, the teacher needs to know the students and the content. Hairstylists think of other things she could try with the hair. In the same way, teachers need to think about how to teach topics, which examples to use, how to organize knowledge, how to use language. And the hairstylist makes sure people come out looking beautiful. And in the same way, if students have misunderstandings, the teacher must clarify them. And a much clearer sense of teachers' work as working with learners, working with knowledge, and managing that learning activities within a classroom space. So significant.
Lee, can I just jump in for a second and say, this is just like I don't know about other people, but this just seems a really, really amazing way of being able to actually overcome knowledge blindness. I mean, there's amongst the kind of what are now quite diverse approaches that came out of being inspired by Basil's late work, trying to bring knowledge into the picture a bit more. I kind of often find a tendency, this bit sort of the idea of powerful knowledge is quite big in the UK, and it tends to be folded in with the notion of the curriculum. And then I think this is horrific, teaching then becomes called like inactive curriculum or something, which is like the complete sort of curriculum, sort of reductionist version of pedagogy, to it just being kind of some sort of reflection of curriculum and just carrying it out. Whereas this seems to be a much more proactive and pedagogic way of bringing knowledge into the picture.
Yeah,
I mean,
thanks, Carl.
it's not just saying there should be knowledge in the curriculum. It's saying you are an expert in knowledge. You need to know how to work with that. So you're going to have to see it. Waves is one way of actually seeing it, and that seems much more intense and much more kind of like making knowledge visible to me than many other ideas. It's really great.
Yeah, and so other students very often, like the one with the policeman, just saying we look after them and keep them out of bad places. I mean, that's just blind to all the parts of this constellation. But ones that say we're a tour, you know, being a teacher is like being a news reader or a tour guide, where we're just giving them the information they need. Also, the potential for fragmented, segmental learning is there, and it needs to be explicitly worked with. And we think that the semantic waves is really a powerful way of doing that. And then what do? So we ended in February in the introjected code. We get them to repeat the same tasks in October, and then their exam assignment, their final assessment task is analyzing the shifts in their own constellations of being a teacher. And in that way, through that process of saying, I used to think this, now I think this, I didn't see that part of teachers' work, but now I see it. We're then taking them back into the sovereign, where we're giving them a deeper understanding of being a teacher, the natures of teaching work, teachers' work, and how they have come to that path. And we do ask them to consider the semantic range of their response, not so much in those words, but what did you have a seed of understanding that now you understand a lot more deeply, and and also to look at constellation clashes and so on. What did you understand that you now totally disagree with, and those shifts in the stances over time as they've moved from their apprenticeship of observation to a more trained gaze. Okay, so coming to the differences that matter for us in teacher education, one of them is the educational background. And why this matters is because of the fragmented part of their emerging constellations, and how that is so important for the work that they do with children when they go back into the classrooms. And so our pedagogical response to that is to make the shifts over time of their emerging epistemological constellations an object for their own study, so that they kind of go into a metacognitive space of becoming aware of their assumptions, and problematizing that, looking at it critically, and coming up with a stronger and properly grounded conception of teaching, as what Wally Morrow had. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nick.
Lee, before we hand over to Nick, there was a question from Marissa about whether there's any difference between primary and secondary pre-service teachers in terms of a particular difference. Marissa, maybe you can clarify the question since we've moved on from when you asked it.
Marissa, yeah, they were all in the same class. That's the Becoming a Teacher course. We found very, very little difference in their initial metaphors. The ones at the end, I think, in October, were very much more kind of give information and working with the knowledge when they were subject specialists. But we found shifts across the board from the foundation. This particular student was a foundation phase student, for example. So we did find shifts across the board.
I mean, you know, there's that classic thing that primary teachers teach children and secondary teachers teach knowledge. So I was just exploring whether that actually existed in the initial conceptions of your teachers when they came in.
There was definitely a distinction between those that give knowledge, like I'm a newsreader, I'm a tour guide or whatever, and those that were completely focused on the care work of teachers, like this particular student. This was one example. Okay, and we think that both are important. So that's why, you know, we wanted the teachers work with knowledge and teachers work with children so that children can work with knowledge. You know, that's the base constellation that we're working with.
So we might find in another context, Lee, maybe sort of like in a country like Australia at the secondary level, we might, if the same kind of exercise was done, I mean, I doubt it, but we might find, you know, more kind of knower blindness, you know,
Yes.
potentially, or there might be a bit of a mixture between the two, and then that enables. So then you'd be able to use that to try and make sure that you've got both sides of the coin, as it were. You know,
Correct.
So if you've got someone who's just like super duper into science, say, at secondary level, and they're a former scientist in science, you know, degree, and they're doing secondary education, and they say, like, you know, being a teacher is like being a whatever, you know, a scientist, because it's all about and the science, like knowledge. That would be just the kind of flip side of this. You know, you'd be able to say, okay, right, well, we'd have to work on the sort of the knower side of things.
That's exactly right. There's metaphor studies analysis done with Turkish and Japanese students, and both of those were very, very much more knower blind than what our students came. But it was interesting for me what kind of the knower attributes they valued. It was the caring side, not the curious side at first. Okay, great. And then Nick, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lee. Right. Engineering is an interesting case. Falls into the category of what you would call an applied natural science. And as such, one can distinguish three very important elements of engineering work. On the one hand, one has the purposeful application of course, specialist engineering knowledge, which is used to meet the needs of the people and society, okay? But all this has to be done in an ethical way. One needs to be cognizant of socioeconomic issues, as well as the possible environmental implications of your engineering work. Therefore, engineers are called to, on the one hand, acquire and apply specialist knowledge within the curriculum, of course, and it's integrated from different fields. One can think of maths, physics, chemistry, social stuff, economic stuff, as well as cultivating a specific way of thinking, a way of solving engineering problems. And that falls back to the design process, which we will look a little bit with an example. Lee? To illustrate this design process as an epistemological constellation of a set of procedures, I often draw on a simple and playful example. This is a typical thing I used to give a couple of years back to first years, as it is very simple, only serves as a very basic, broad strokes introduction to the process, but I, at that stage, found it quite useful. So, problem situation, you're driving through the Karoo with your girlfriend on holiday and your car breaks down. For those who don't know, the Karoo is a remote, arid semi-desert in the center of South Africa. Distances between towns are large, and therefore having a car breakdown can be a huge problem. This example, of course, being a good engineer, you always keep with you a bunch of resistors in your back pockets, and of course a 6-pack of beer in the boot just in case. What do you do in order to charge your cell phone whose battery now has gone dead? This example is located within the prosaic code, where meanings are simpler, weaker semantic density, and of course tied to examples and experience, a stronger semantic gravity. The example is aimed at offering a very simple and contextual problem situations that students hopefully can relate to. Lee? Also, the example is aimed at serving two main purposes. On the one hand, it serves as a very basic introduction to the overall design process as a constellation of key procedures. One, of course, needs to start and identify the problem at hand, extract the purpose, of course, the limitations and constraints, and all this located within the prosaic code. It's the context. Let's look at the context. Let's figure out what's going on. Then, at the second level, I guide students towards a research stage, which is, of course, located within the rhizomatic code, where one starts identifying complex and abstract theories, principles, models that can be solved can be used to solve this cell phone charging problem. Finally, the tour is concluded by moving the students from the worldly code into from the rhizomatic into the worldly code, where these complex theories and models are brought to bear within the specific engineering problem at hand. Values are calculated, components are chosen, and a design solution is presented. At the second level, we're looking at the application of the voltage divider principle, which is an important concept that the students need to understand. In this case, well, I probe the students to try and find out what voltage is needed, what voltage is available to us, think of car battery, what components we have, what principles to use, in this case, Kirchhoff laws, Ohm's law, leading, of course, to the voltage divider principle, and come up with a circuit that ultimately gets evaluated as to its efficacy. Lee? So now comes the interesting part. Certain reflections that come out of this example. Where does this leave us so far? Through this process, this example, I've attempted to make explicit certain epistemological constellations that make up the engineering process. However, a close examination of the problem statement that I gave to the students reveals something quite interesting. There seems to be an implicit message about who gets valued as a good engineer. Lee? Effectively, we're looking at a good future engineer being resourceful and quick thinking. I have mentioned something about a girlfriend. One can draw links to a heterosexual male. He owns a car, possibly a driver's license, of course. He goes on holiday, enjoys alcohol. In essence, I'm speaking to a certain, inadvertently, middle-class example. And it's unfortunately the prevalent stereotype of engineers as being predominantly male, forward, resourceful, bit of a cowboy. And this contradicts quite starkly with the lived experience of many of our students. Some have never been to the Karoo. They may not even know where it is. Many do not have a car or a driver's license, or for that matter, able to go on holiday. From the infographic, we can see that a large percentage of our students use public transport or a university bus service, they walk onto campus. Very few have the luxury of actually owning a car and driving themselves. Therefore, although everyone has access to the engineering principles and knowledge for cultivating this engineering solving approach, of course, engineering belongs in knowledge code, and knowledge matters a lot more than one's knower attributes. However, students may not be able to read themselves within the specific playful example, may feel alienated, excluded, reminded of what they may not have. And as I'm making assumptions about the material resources, the sexual orientation, religion or religious practices, the point about alcohol, and that can create a problem. One can try and bridge this gap and address the problem by using more contextually relevant examples. However, one needs to be very careful not to further put students on the spot by highlighting pain. Being a bit flippant here, changing the example to being a student living in an informal settlement, having no electricity, being forced to build a circuit to charge their old cell phone is not a good way of doing it. You're marginalizing the students even further. However, one could rework the example by drawing on a more shared current reality. The last couple of years, we've had the power grid in South Africa has been fairly constrained. We've had unstable power, resulting in rolling power cuts almost on a daily basis. Within this reality, which is of course frustrating to all, the cell phone charging example becomes a lot more relevant. However, once again, one should be very, very careful about who the valued knower becomes within the examples used. Thanks, Lee.
Nick, I think there was a question from someone.
Okay.
Nick, it's Steve. It was just a quick question about whether
Yes,
the problematizing of your context, I mean, is this a hypothetical thing, or do you actually problematize this,
No,
the context and the middle class driver and so on with the students? And if so, I wondered, did you problematize before the task or after the task? Because obviously that could make a difference to how far students are willing to engage, perhaps.
Well, obviously, this is a completely, if I understand you correctly, this is a completely class example. So there's no building or testing here, and the choice of the example is purely to try and playfully try and bring students on board and make the, of course, environment more lighthearted. But of course, one doesn't realize the implications of the example you use. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Steve.
Yeah, kind of. I guess I wondered whether, as in the previous examples, this problematizing of the context and who is in the examples and so on actually becomes an explicit part of the pedagogy. Do you problematize the example that you used in the task with the students to question their
I suppose no. I suppose I haven't. I don't delve into the reasons why I've chosen this example. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, can I ask you one too?
Sorry, can I just follow on what Nick was just saying? Steve, if this were an example in a teacher education class, for example, it would very much be explicitly unpacked and so on. But I think Nick's teaching engineers. Yusuf, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned that, look, changing it to a situation where, maybe you're in a township's informal settlement kind of situation, and you need to jerry-rig something to charge your phone, would further marginalize the students. But I mean, do you have evidence of that, or is there some theoretical reason? Because I mean, my experience with it is that it ends up sometimes, well, I don't know, maybe the students are just, not telling me who feel marginalized, of course, but I've had feedback on some problems where they say, well, look, it basically makes me feel validated that, look, a person from, these upper class backgrounds isn't the only one who can apply this knowledge in an upper class kind of context. It's us in our daily lived contexts who run into these problems and can do these things and can be these people as well. So, yeah, so I'm just wondering on what you said about the marginalized part.
No, Yusuf, you got a point. And I suppose it can cut both ways. It becomes a case of which way do you go? Do you now focus on the problem situations, which on the one hand may actually empower and validate, or do you now emphasize the deficiency? I don't have, reminding someone that their daily existence is pretty crappy. And I suppose it goes back to the funny situations sometimes we find ourselves in South Africa, where you're not always sure how far to go. So yes, I don't have evidence of whether it makes a difference or not, but I suppose you could read a sense of, we must be careful. That's where I think that's the message I'm trying to put across at the moment.
100%. Got it. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question from Yusuf. I mean, I'd also say that you start down this path and you end up with one example for each student eventually, because people have such an array and a diversity of experiences. You could end up with having to, do so many different kinds of examples that in order to try and embrace all those different kinds of experiences that people come with. That might be another problem.
I think that's an important point, Carl. I think that the call for the student, the call for from the student body was when every message that you get is that you don't belong, where every single example excludes who you are, and every image is somebody who doesn't look like you. It just then feels like, okay, so I'm not recognized in this space. And I think that that's what we're trying to address here is, if this is one example out of many with, different Noah attributes coming to the fore, some people then start to see themselves in the course. But when it's only one set of attributes that is repeatedly valued, it starts to kind of feel, okay, well, am I a real participant in this class? I'm here, but I'm kind of left on the margins a bit. And I think that it's just something that we need to be aware of.
If I can come in here, I mean, it's an example that we shared while we were preparing this. And I was talking about evolution, and it tied in with Nick's example of understanding the example and the implications. Is when I started evolution as a first-year student, not teaching it now, as a student in a first-year class, and the lecturer at the time asking if everybody had heard of Charles Darwin, and I had not, and they were probably, well, it was back in 95 or so I'm showing my age here, but we had not done it at school. And he basically said that if you hadn't heard of Charles Darwin or didn't know who he was or the significance of it, then you shouldn't be in this classroom. And immediately it put me on the periphery. And so it's that kind of awareness that I think we really like to highlight within this presentation, is how our examples and the way that we interact with students can marginalize. And that sometimes by being explicit about just knowing, about acknowledging the diversity, it just changes the dynamics of the classroom. So yeah, just by way of example, there you go. Thanks.
Thanks, Kersh. Thanks, Kershree. So coming back to what the differences that matter. In Nick's case, the significant social relations were their social identities and their socioeconomic background. And why it matters is the gap between the envisaged and the actual knower who's in the class, and to try and kind of reduce that distance in the problem situation, that all students not only just have access to the epistemological constellation of the engineering approach, but also that they start seeing themselves as valid knowers in that space. And so, in effect, what we're trying to argue here is that even though we were all dealing with epistemological constellations in evolution, in teachers' work, and in an engineering approach, that there were social attributes of our students that we actually really had to consider. This isn't about working with the social relations in relation to that, being a scientist or so on, but it was what they brought into that learning situation that actually in some way articulated or interfered or had some kind of connection that made the epistemological constellating work different. And ignoring it could very well cause problems. But what we tried to do here is to show our pedagogic responses, not to every single aspect of diversity, but for those aspects that matter for the knowledge building work that we were trying to do. And what we really found, and this talk emerged out of our discussions that we've had at the Wits LCT Group, where we learning LCT and learning how to teach with it and how to think about it and use it in our research. We found that the LCT provided us with a set of concepts and analytic tools that we could have these kind of interdisciplinary conversations and see how, for example, for Kershree, it was about preempting a constellation clash that she knew was coming. And for us in teacher education, it was very much about taking an incomplete constellation and increasing its semantic range so that students came to have a better and more nuanced understanding of teachers' work. And in Nick, it was the responsiveness to the contextual realities of students, even though they all had access to the target knowledge of his constellation, which was the engineering approach. So what we'd like to just invite you to do in the next 10 minutes is, give us examples from your own situation of differences that matter, and perhaps how these tools of LCT help us to make these sort of things explicit, visible, and then once they're visible, we don't need to feel overwhelmed by the diversity. We can start to think about principles of knowledge building work and what kind of responsiveness is needed in relation to what you teach, to make sure that the students have are set up for success. And of course, as I just go back to that, the diagram of our education system, where we're really desperately trying to make sure that our pedagogic responses are for all students, supporting all, the success of all, instead of just individualized little approaches that provide additional support for some, but often leave out the students who perhaps are too shy to come forward and ask for that additional support. We make that learning available to everybody, and everybody benefits. Thank you very much.
Can I maybe throw a, you know, just a small spanner into the works here? I mean, I'm actually really interested in the way that that you approached it, and honestly, it's the way that if I was doing it, I would probably approach it as well. But you know, if because what you've done, as far as I can see, is you've taken the kind of epistemic constellation, you know, and then the axiological constellations, right? And you kind of say, okay, so you know, we need to teach, you know, this at least for science, the kind of epistemic constellation here. So you know, how is it positively or negatively charged, given, you know, what people are coming from? Is that sort of plus or minus what's going on?
Sorry, so not all of the students will regard the scientific constellation as negatively charged.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I'm wondering what happens if you kind of approach it from the other way around. What if you start from the you know, from some common or dominant axiological constellation, right? Like, let's say, I don't know, very staunch Christians, you know, maybe evangelical Christians view on evolution, right? And you know, you kind of go, well, okay, these are you know, cases of attitudes evolving in the Bible or where you come from, and these are cases of you know, where evolution is hinted at in your text, and all of that stuff, and then kind of bring their context into the epistemological, rather than kind of, you know, for example, you showed that survey where, you know, people kind of ended up rating themselves on, you know, how open are you to this or that. Mm-hmm. Maybe, you know, would it be an interesting thing to see, well, can we move from the opposite direction, where people are right now axiologically, and, well, how close can you come to the episteme, to the constellation that we want you to be in, you know, given your already existing kind of constellation. Does that kind of make sense?
I think that's pretty much what we do, and maybe that didn't come across strongly enough, is that we do start with the survey. You know, when I start off, when we have just a general sort of 15 minutes about what the course is going to be about and that kind of thing, and then we also acknowledge that it's not easy for people to engage with this. And then we actually present the survey, we engage with it, and so it does open up that space all the way through for people to be bringing in their own beliefs and things like that. But what we say is that while there are all of these different constellations at play, what we need to foreground and what we need to be engaging with in the classroom space or in this particular course, the knowledge that we want to get across and for people to engage with, is the scientific constellation. So yes, absolutely, we acknowledge and we bring in space for being able to discuss the others so that everyone's aware of it, and so that kind of takes away any charge. Well, it never does. I mean, the charge is always there, but at least it acknowledges that there are these different ways of looking at it, and then we work with the scientific constellation. And every so often, these other things come into play because we've allowed the space for that to come in right from the beginning. I don't know if that answers the question.
So I just want to build on that, Kershree and Yusuf, and you know, every teacher has pedagogic choices about how they select and sequence the knowledge. So you know, what you propose is perfectly, a legitimate selection. But what we're trying to show here is that just being overwhelmed or ignoring it is perhaps constrains the knowledge building unnecessarily, whereas Kershree's found, you open it up, you put it on the table, and it forms the starting point and breaks down resistance to what would be a negatively charged constellations for some members of the class, but everybody learns about something in that way. Yeah, I'm wondering, sorry, I can't see who else's hands are up.
Aaron has a hand
Lee,
up.
hi.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Can you actually hear me?
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic, because you can't see me because I'm in Nicholas West's Karoo, metaphorically, in that I'm on my phone via audio, but I got you guys on the screen on my computer because my laptop crashed. So I had to download and install Zoom. I did a typical South African.
Okay, Kareem, we're running out of time.
Yes.
Do you want to jump in?
The issue is just, I was going to say, in terms of in the South African context of coming from so many different kind of complexities and moving towards that knowledge building, moving towards the epistemological, what we have found that when we engage with different students' positions and conceptions of where they're coming from in relation to that knowledge, we have a lot of our lecturers at Stellenbosch experimenting with that, especially in the emergency remote teaching space, by drawing on their own examples, exactly as someone suggested in the chat. And while it was an invaluable exercise and it included things like peer review and peer learning, the workload for lecturers, when you start to individualize and contextualize, we've gone all the way to the other side where lecturers are drowning in that, attempting to be so inclusive that everyone's matters. So we're at a point where a middle ground must be found so that we don't lose sight of the very knowledge that we're trying to build. That's what I was just going to say.
Thanks. And I think that that's really an important point, because that individualized approach, given the massification of our system, given all kinds of, the diversities and so on, is just overwhelming. And so this is why we tried to work with the idea of differences that matter as a principle for how one works with everybody, but giving support and making that support available to all, and being very mindful of that, and everybody then benefits in the end. Okay.
Can I just say that I think this has been really great. I mean, not only as a round table, but I mean also as a sort of like a kind of a sort of shorter model of what we can do in LCT 3.5 with with groups coming around a coherent problem and reaching across such a wide range of sort of like, for example, subjects. I mean, you covered, I should say, some different subject areas, and you've also covered like several dimensions without it getting lost in too many, differences of topic or too much sort of conceptual detail. So I think it's been really, really great. And it shows you if you set up a problem and then bring concepts and topics to bear, the problem will keep you, with some discipline, will keep you on track. And so it made a lot of sense to me. I really hope that we get this published, in a kind of bigger form. You know what I mean?
Thanks, Carl.
Well, there's a lot of positivity in the chat. We'll save it for you. Mauricio will send it to you. But there's a lot of people saying, wonderful, excellent, blah, blah, blah.
Thanks very much. And our group, Learning LCT, meets every Wednesday, 2:30 South African time. And we're not just a group of Wits students, Wits staff members and students. We've got members from universities across South Africa, and we've got people from many different countries that join us every week. And so, yeah, if you'd like to learn LCT with us, you'd be very welcome. Thank you.
Does anybody have any more comments or thoughts? I mean, there's been loads in the chat, as I've said. A lot of people really inspired by using, for example, the autonomy plane to sort of understand those questions using analogy, or waves as content knowledge. I think we can actually start figuring out what professional knowledge for a teacher might actually be. It might be things like the knowledge of semantic waves and the knowledge of autonomy tours and things like that. Does anybody have any more questions or comments? You just jump in.
I just wanted to chime in, and more so than about the subject matter, which is very interesting and super useful for everyone, I think. But also just making a comment about the use of LCT too, in this sense, which is that it's amazing to see such a I don't know, such a group of diverse people working together using constellations and using, again, many of the or all of LCT's dimensions. And to me, it shows that how constellations can make use of all of the dimensions in order to aid in building up the cosmology, the constellation, and all of that. And I think it's very interesting that each dimension adds something and allows, for example, the use of autonomy to determine, I don't know, which elements go to what purpose, and then specialization to use to analyze what's the basis of the, the epistemological or the axiological charge and all of that. I think it was a very, very interesting and amazing both show of how LCT can work together with many dimensions, and also and I think this is very it's a good call, which is that I think in time many multidisciplinary and multi-people teams of LCT using people can get together and work on one issue from many diverse perspectives using the dimensions, and that gives us a very thorough in this case, a look on how constellations are built about teaching, especially in the case of South Africa and all of that. So to me, that was fantastic to see. Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa.
By the way, for people who are still here, I actually uploaded Constellating Science into the chat. So if you want a copy of that, you can just flick up and find it and download it for free as the chapter. So because it's a useful sort of way in, probably. But has anybody got any other comments? I thought it was fabulous. I've got loads and loads of notes myself, but I can chat to Lee at any time and the other people. Anyone?
I think if I can just add that this presentation kind of captured what LCT, the Wits LCT group, and what other groups can do. And it's that we have a shared language of LCT that allows us to come from our very different contexts and discuss the important stuff. It's the glue that holds our family together. And I think this presentation really, really captured that.
Yep. No, I think so. I think this really does show that. I mean, like in a written format, we'd need a lot more space to unpack, and to a non-LCT community. So inside the LCT community, this is a wonderful example of how we can do like the groups of 3.5 and so on. And actually then maybe colloquia or things like that when we go back to face-to-face, kind of whole sessions that people can organize. Outside non-LCT people, we'd have to unpack a lot more concepts, because otherwise they just go straight over people's heads, and then the balance might be a bit too much, but for us it's fabulous, and it real kind of provides a basis for I could see, for example, a series of papers or a series of chapters and things like that, where you do get the space to do that. I mean, and so much innovation. So I know a number of people said about using, as I said, the analogy idea, and constellations with also things like semantics and specialization brought together really nicely. And I think it's really important that people, like, I think this shows really, really well how it is knowledge and knowers. It is not just about bringing knowledge back in and elbowing out anything to do with knowers. It is, I mean, we teach something to somebody, and both those things are really, really important.
Mm.
You know? And I think you've been showing that in a number of different ways. So I can see the analogy thing as well as being something that people can use in all sorts of areas, you know, like particularly when there's so much emphasis in, for example, New South Wales science schooling at times on the being a scientist, and without any sense of what that might be, you know.
Mm.
Well,
Okay.
and
Thank
unless
you very
anybody's got
much.
anything else, I'm going to say thank you so much for our group who worked really, really well. It was really coherent, really clear, really engaging. You know, having so many people present in one go, it worked really brilliantly in the end. I know you put a lot of effort into that, so thank you guys for that. And thanks everyone else who's been along and been a part of this today. We again had like a fantastic turnout from across the world and time zones, and hopefully, you know, despite the fact that this is a bit of a kind of stilted sort of like medium, I hope that you all feel a little bit more connected into the community, because it is an incredibly friendly community. So if you're not a part of a group, join one, find one. If there's none in your country, find one nearby. And if you can find one other person, organize to meet regularly. That's it. That's how groups start. So that's how LCT Mexico began, for example, and now they're thriving. So I encourage you to work, because we are more together, far more together. So thank you very much to LCT Wits for that sort of silent clapping. And also, as I said, everybody for coming. And I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks' time for LCT Singapore on pedagogic interventions. So awesome, everyone. Thanks. And this chat will be sent to you, to Lee, and then you can send it out to other people. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, and by the way, the any articles that were put into chat are on the database in the LCT website, or will be very soon.
Cool.
Oh, great.
Bye.